Thank you very much. It's good. Yeah, it's good. Yeah. So, welcome to this Experts at Work, which is on UK work culture and productivity. And we're really pleased to welcome back Adrian and Martin. So, Adrian Walcott and Martin Roach are with organisational cultural specialists, Brands with Values, and they're drawing on their UK Culture Study 2025. This is the second year we've run this. It's been really interesting hearing what they have to say on things like psychological safety, engagement, and other key issues that are affecting UK PLC. Chaps, thanks again for doing this because it was lovely to have you on last time. Adrian's a brand marketeer, formerly with Eurostar, Barclays, as we've just heard, Unilever, and Nestle at Ogilvy Advertising, and is also a co-founder of BAME 2020. Martin's a designer and strategist who formerly ran an ethical branding agency working with Fairtrade International, the NHS, Goldsmiths, and Bernardo's, amongst others. So do send us questions and observations and suggestions via the chat throughout. Chaps, I'll keep an eye on the chat. We'll send those slides around later, and we've got a half finish at 1:45 p.m. Please do put yourselves on mute for now, as I say, if you haven't already. I think you all have, actually. And Adrian, I think you're going to start us off, aren't you? Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, I will. So, obviously, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting us. Before I hand over to Martin, I just thought I'd introduce the world that Martin and I live in, right? So, we go out on the road and we talk to people about culture, right? And we're doing it because it's around mergers or onboarding new CEOs or it's AI transformation or whatever else, right? But in these conversations around culture, what can sometimes happen is very interesting, right? So, we start talking about culture. And what happens is I start to hear back from people in these roles, and they say, yeah, culture is really, really important to us. And we've invested heavily in the culture, and we've created a set of values, we've created a set of behaviors, we've put it in the attraction, selection, onboarding, it's in the learning and development plan, and it's in the reward and recognition. And these values and culture are so important. We've produced books like the one I've just shown you, as well as used it to name magazines. And we use that culture to make really important decisions when our brand's under strain. And it all sounds really, really interesting, all sounds really positive. And they talk with such assurance that I then sort of then take a step back and then start to ask them some questions and say, so how's this culture performing that you've articulated in such a way? And when we start to peel it back, they start to tell me about there's some issues around maybe turnover, there's productivity issues, there's issues around brand reputation and operational efficiency. And I say to myself, well, we've just had this great conversation about what you're doing in the culture space, but here we are, we're now starting to discover there's some bits going wrong in the culture. And to me, that happens because what people are very good at is declaring the culture, right? So there's always this big declaration around the culture, but sometimes where the struggle is how do you harmonize the culture? So how do you harmonize it so it starts to connect with employees? And that's where we can find the gap. And I sometimes think it's because people think, well, colleagues just come in and assimilate into the culture. But of course they don't, because they have their own personal values that drive them and shape them. And they have to connect with those of the organization. It's also sometimes the ground is not fertile to land this culture or these values because there's loads of poor health in the culture. And sometimes there could be issues around psychological safety that make it difficult for this culture to land. It's almost as if you need, a bit like farmers who want to understand the soil composition, right, to allow myriad flowers to grow. Or I suspect with this very high profile audience, it's what winemakers, they want to understand the terroir to make great wine. And this is sometimes lost. And what we're going to share with you is basically how we go about harmonizing cultures so that when it comes to landing culture to deliver change and transformation, it sticks. So the principles behind harmonization is what we're going to share with you at a UK level because we want you to think about these around how you learn culture. Because from our point of view, the difference between good and great culture transformation is harmonization. So I'm hoping some of these concepts we share with you, where we attempt to harmonize the UK, because this is a UK study, you'll find some of these concepts interesting. So it's a bit heavy to begin with because there's a lot of methodology and structure behind what we do. But hopefully, it should then lend itself to a good debate around some of the key things that we are seeing that are potentially aiding or stopping uh, how we would harmonise the UK if we were driving a UK transformation programme. And with that, I'll hand over to Martin.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you very much, Richard, for having us back again for our second presentation. All right, so I suppose the best place to start is really our approach to measuring culture. I'll spend a couple of minutes on that, and then I'll launch into the actual data. The first thing that's a little bit different about what we do is that we only ask three questions. It typically takes about 6 minutes to complete the culture decoder. And the three questions that we ask are, what are your personal values? So that's, what is it that motivates you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What is it you see within the workplace? We call that workplace values. So what is it that the organization is doing that manifests itself on a day-to-day basis? And what is it you desire from the actual culture? And the way that this question is actually phrased, it's around what is it you desire, but also what is it you wish to retain within the organization as well. And then from here, we're able to elicit quite a lot of data. If we're doing a study around this size, we'll have around 4 million data points to actually analyze. So this is very much, don't worry, I'm not going to take you through 4 million data points. This is very much a summary, but we're going to take you through some of the highlights. And if I do my job well, I should stop by around past at least, and then give you guys a bit of time to have a discussion or ask any questions. Academic model, as you would expect, the one that we have landed upon has been devised by Professor Shalom Schwartz. It's almost like Maslow 2.0. The main difference between Maslow, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is of course that's a hierarchical system. This is a circular value system. And there are some cool things that you can do with a circular value system. So if we take the top right, the guardian space, tradition and safety, we can see that sits opposite the innovator space, bottom left, independence and adventure. And what that means is that if you have a lot of policies within your organization, a lot of safeguards, it may crowd out things like innovation and creativity. Conversely, if you are a very success-driven organization, it may drive out collaboration if success is at the fore. So in this instance, I'm putting champions opposite citizens there, bottom right against the top left. And then the other sort of important aspect, finally, on this particular wheel, that's important to point out, is that on the right-hand side, tradition, safety, authority, success, these are extrinsic value sets. So these are described as values that are such as money, external reward, and so money, fame, etc., prestige. And on the left-hand side, we have intrinsic value sets. So things that you do for the love of it, right? So reading for the love of knowledge, or helping people because it gives you a nice fuzzy feeling. There are lots of other things that we can elicit from this particular system, but I just thought I'd give you those couple of examples because I will be referring back into those as we go through. All right, that's enough for the academics. Let's get into a bit of fun, a bit into the actual data. So in terms of completion rates, last year we had nearly 6,400, a bit less this year, just over 6,000 completions. Still good though. And we try and look at that across 30 different industries. So it's a nice representation, a nice sample of the UK. And of course, we're looking at that across leadership levels. We're looking at it across departments. We're looking at it across location across the UK. All the things that you would expect. So let's have a look at the personal values. So what is the identity of the people in the UK? And the way that I'm presenting this stuff back is I'm looking at the categories. What are the highest categories? And the top three categories that we have for 2025 are exactly the same as the top three categories that we had in 2024. So community is important. That's about being honest and collaborative. Tradition is important. That's about being respectful and polite. And safety is important. And one of the big words for safety is about being reliable. And tradition and safety, there's no change between 24 and 25, but community has gone down a little bit. And it's also important to pick out what the lowest levels of personal identity in the UK are, and that is adventure and authority. Adventure is about being bold. It's about change. It's also about challenging, yeah, and disruption. Authority is about being leading and premium. So they are the two categories. When we look at the data, they're the two categories that have the least amount of words. And of course, the personal values are very, very important when we go into organizations, because if we are looking at creating change, or if we're looking at setting a set of values, understanding the actual identity of the people that you're working with is very, very critical. And you can imagine it's an important piece if you're doing work around leadership as well. Okay, so you remember the three questions that we have: personal values, what's going on in the workplace, and what's going on desired. What is it you desire? Within the workplace experience question, we can elicit some other measures. So I'll take you through some of the measures that we have. One of them is a measure that looks at belonging. And the way that we calculate belonging is that it's an algorithm that looks at the distance between the personal values and the workplace values. So we assign a number to the personal values, what gets you out of bed in the morning, and we assign a number to the workplace experience, and then we calculate the distance between the two of them. The optimum for this is 100%, and the belonging has actually gone up since 2024 to 2025. So that means that whatever we whatever we think is important at a personal level, and we're seeing more of it within the workplace. That might not necessarily be great for innovation and change, because we can see that that's not necessarily huge for our personal values. But it does mean that there is a sense of belonging that we can attach to it. Interestingly enough, what we saw in 2024 was that males had higher, just slightly, more belonging than females in 2024. But that has slightly changed in 2025. They're still by and by the same, but it has slightly changed. So maybe there's a little discussion point there that we can potentially explore. The other thing that we measure is the amount of creativity and innovation within the workplace. And the way that we map this is that we look at two specific measures, and they are around adventure and they're around that independence category. So they're the two categories that we're looking at. And we're looking for evidence, and we're looking for activity within those two categories. And what we see is that there is an average of, across the respondents, 28% of people see evidence of creativity and innovation within their working environment. That's up 2 points. But obviously, as you can imagine, that leaves us with a huge amount of potential of untapped resource, considering the amount of CEOs and leadership teams who wish to drive innovation. It leaves us with quite a lot. And this, we've actually got a seniority breakdown here. In the light blue is 2024, the dark blue is 2025. And essentially what this is saying is that 50% of the executive see evidence of creativity and innovation in their businesses. And that drops to below 20% when it comes to the junior level. And I think what's also interesting is the gap between the executive board, and the non-executive board. And the reason why I find that very interesting is because the non-exec directors rely on the information from the executive board to understand what's happening within the business. But we're seeing a bit of a gap. It's quite a large gap, actually. It's about 25 points. So we're seeing a gap between that. Again, quite interesting, maybe something that we can pull out in the discussion as well. We also have a measure around cultural health. Now, the way that we describe this is that these are the real derailers against the culture that you would want to create. So Adrian, he showed us that the creation that he made when he was at Barclays, the stuff within the cultural health will derail all of the goodwill that can come from these kind of experiences, right? If you don't get this right. So overall, the way in which we create the measurement for this is that there is a data set of words within the workplace culture question. What is it you see within the workplace? And these are potentially limiting sentiments. And we calculate the amount of them. We have a benchmark of around 20% because 20% of the words within there are limiting. So the UK falls at 18%, so it's okay. So 18% of the words that were selected are potentially limiting. And I'll give you, and these are exactly what they are actually. So these are the top 5 cultural health issues that we see within the UK: demanding, cost-reducing, long hours, poorly planned, and hierarchical. And you can see that the top 4 have increased, some by only 1 point, but the demanding one has gone up quite a bit. Hierarchical has gone down by 1 point. I just want to spend 1 second talking about the demanding aspect because quite rightly we get asked about this quite a lot. And what we're looking for is the cocktail of limiting factors, right? So if you have a culture that's demanding and that's pretty much on its own, then that's fine. You know, a lot of leadership teams thrive in a demanding area. We see that that's not necessarily the case for more junior members, but for leadership teams, that may be the case. So we're looking at where the demanding aspect actually is. But when we see a culture that is potentially demanding, long hours, poorly planned, hierarchical, we're going to be saying, well, look, that is a recipe for a very challenging environment when you have these elements all together. And indeed, demanding and long hours, if we see a lot of that, then of course that can lead to burnout. So that's how we configure it. And of course, if you've got any more questions about the cultural health, then please ping it into the chat and we can address those. These are the industries with the lowest levels of toxicity. So construction, it's gone down by 3 points. Professional services, that's gone down, and financial services, it's gone down as well. So these guys are the ones who have scored with below that sort of baseline of 20%. And then these are the 3 industries or sectors where I would say that there's very high levels of challenge. So government is at 35%. That's gone up 9 points. Education has gone up, and hospital and healthcare. So clearly, the public sector, as we're seeing, have a lot more challenges than the private sector, and we're able to elicit that with the data that we're seeing. But you can imagine if you're running an organisation where there are 35% of challenge is coming through, and you're trying to land a new leadership framework or some principles, or whatever it is, then you need to address these challenges before you actually bring those in. We also have a rating for burnout, and the way in which we calculate burnout is we look at the coupling of demanding and long hours. So it doesn't seem to be a huge issue within the UK as a whole. It was at 7% in 2024, and it's gone down to 5%. The optimum is 0 once again. These are the industries where burnout is lowest. So construction, manufacturing, and transportation. So kind of linked to logistics, those 3. And once again, these are the areas have the highest levels of burnout. So hospital and healthcare up to 16%. It's actually gone down by 1 point. Government and retail, these are the areas where we see the highest levels of burnout. And of course, as you can imagine, when we are looking through the data, sometimes what we see is a squeezed middle that have a huge amount of, something like 30%, and the leadership may only be at 10%. So this is also a really, really good indicator when we are working through the data with our clients. Richard, at the very beginning, he mentioned psychological safety, and this is a very important measure that we've developed over the last 2 years in conjunction with a client who wanted us to look at risk culture, specifically within the financial sector, but we've been able to roll this out across to all of our clients. So this is how it applies to the UK overall. So the way in which we calculate it is that we have 4 pillars for psychological safety. They are open communication, healthy challenge, trust, and conflict resolution, which has actually been updated now to conflict empathy. Before I send this out to you, I will correct that for you, that little typo. But what we see in 2024 is that it's at 43%. So 43% of the respondents see evidence of open communication, healthy challenge, trust, and conflict resolution across the whole. And it's 41% there in 2025. And then we've got a breakdown for each of those areas. The little trick that we've done here is that healthy challenge. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but healthy challenge is actually split across two axes. So it's across that adventure piece, so that's being able to speak out, and also tradition, which is about being respectful and polite. So we can quickly see that across 2024 and 25, that open communication and trust, they were the highest recorded instances, highest amount of evidence. So 45% of respondents saw evidence of open communication and trust. The tradition piece just comes a little bit lower. It's gone down a couple of points, but still relatively good evidence. And then the healthy challenge piece and the conflict resolution, now rebranded to conflict empathy, are really the lowest. So we can quickly see across the UK potentially areas where we are strongest in psychological safety and areas where we need some sort of improvement. And I've got the breakdown again for you across sectors as well. So these are the highest levels of psychological safety across sectors. So admin services, hospital, healthcare, and transportation. And so it's an interesting one, isn't it? So hospital healthcare they do suffer when it comes to cultural health. There are high levels of burnout, but there is also higher levels of psychological safety, which is really good to know, compared to other sectors, of course, because they are dealing with human life, of course. And then the sectors where psychological safety is lowest is retail, construction, and government as well. And I thought it'd also be interesting for you to have a look at what is it we desire from the workplace, because we're all in the business of creating great cultures. So what is it that UK PLC is saying that they would say that they desire from the workplace? And what we see, the top three categories are community, safety, and success, and the lowest two are adventure and authority. And as you can guess, I mean, this isn't exactly a million miles away from where it is at the moment in terms of what they're actually experiencing within the workplace. And of course, if we're looking at innovation, if we're looking at entrepreneurship, as we're working with some clients at the moment, whilst the belonging may be quite strong, driving change across UK PLC will come with some challenges. And the reason why it's challenging is twofold. Number one, as we can see, it's not necessarily desired across the board, but we know that leaders desire it more. And then number two, more importantly, is if we look at the personal identity of the UK as a whole, we can see that because innovation isn't necessarily hardwired into people, then you need to take them on a bit of a journey, right? You can't just say, right, just change and then everybody changes. You need to take them on a bit of a journey. So that's what the data is showing us quite clearly. I just want to end with three slides before I stop talking, give my mouth a bit of a break. And that is really the importance of highlighting culture and performance, which you guys are always being asked to do, but we've got some data here to reinforce it. So what we also, within the survey, we ask all the responders to self-certify and tell us whether they are above average, average, or below average performing organization in terms of finance. And what we see is that the above average performing organizations have higher levels of psychological safety compared to below average performing organizations. And that's true across 2024 and 2025. Yeah. So, it's not quite a 20-point difference, but, it's definitely a 15-point difference between psychological safety and performance there. We can also correlate that towards belonging as well. So above average performing organizations have higher levels of belonging compared to below average organizations. And then the third slide that I have here is then when we look at the cultural health, and this is probably, well, it is not probably, it is the most stark in terms of difference. An above average organization has fewer cultural health issues compared to a below average performing organization. So, when you are asked quite rightly by the CFO to correlate performance and culture, we believe that these slides certainly begin to do that. And with that, I think I'd hand back to Richard whilst I try to take my slides down.
I love the nuance on that. There's some really interesting findings there. What do network members think? Were the things that struck you, that surprised you? It's quite interesting that there's some low levels of psychological safety in some sectors, but they've also got high levels of belonging. I think that was construction, for instance. But yeah, what do people think? Please feel free to raise your hand or just come in. Adrian and Martin, in your view, why has belonging gone up 3%? That was quite a nice surprise, particularly when in our networks we often talk about work from home and how that affects culture and people buying into that culture. So that was in some ways perhaps a pleasant surprise, for me at least.
You want to second that one, Adrian? Or
Yeah, well, I think these things are always interesting debates, right? But if you look at, I don't know, if you look at leadership and you look at the profile of leadership, you look at the challenge that senior leadership have been through in the last over the last period, all the elections, the Trumps, the this, you can see they're having a harder time. So it might be just proportionality in the numbers that we're seeing that difference in why those belonging scores are different between the groups. It could well be that. I guess there could be other things. I think the point necessarily is not so much the numbers. I think for the people we work with, it's about understanding this to be able to deliver on your strategy. So I think the big one that Martin talked to, which I think is extremely relevant because we hear it all the time, there's millions, billions being spent on AI, and it's being positioned as the new holy grail for the world of business. And you've got the consultants spending huge, and the clients spending huge amounts of money on trying to put AI into the business. But that piece I talked at the beginning between sort of declaration and harmonization, it's great to declare that we want to become an AI first business. But if you look clearly at our data, you can see that it's difficult to land AI when you've got massive issues around innovation, perceived innovation in the business. And when you've got that split between the non-exec and the executive, and then you've got the people at junior levels. And this is the piece that's often missed is we spend 50 billion on AI and we'll spend £5 on change and adoption, and then we'll wonder why these things don't land. And I think our job is to furnish um, colleagues on this call with the data so that you can really take advantage of these things. So that's a long answer, but it just frames why we have these discussions, particularly around that. You can see the same in cultural health. So if you're in a business where you've got quite a challenged culture and you're in the middle of a merger and you're busy putting systems together, well, actually, if you've got £1 left in HR, you should be investing on improving the health of the culture because it has a knock-on effect on everything else. So that's the spirit of the stuff that we try to show.
Hmm. Okay. And then on the belonging going up, I just guess one reason for it might be that we're putting more and more into that as organisations to make that work, which might explain why it's gone up by 3%,
Yeah,
possibly. I don't know. What do colleagues think? Do you see that people are feeling that they're belonging more? Do you feel like you've got a community at work?
looks like Julia has a question. I think we know Julia.
Yeah, hello. Hello
Hello,
again.
Julie.
Good
Hello.
to see you. Um, a couple of things really. It's more commentary. So one is I kind of find it heartening and equally disheartening in the same way, if that makes sense. So from a heartening perspective, in a world that is increasingly polarized, and we live, especially at the moment, things are so polarized, to see that UK PLC, 6,700 responses are about community, which is honest, collaboration, respect, politeness, safety, belonging, is really heartening. I think what's disheartening is being bold and challenging and wanting to disrupt, because not only are we in a polarized world, we're in a world where the economy needs to grow. So I think that's quite that's just the backdrop. But a couple of questions. One was the female situation, that I know it's only changed slightly, but just wondering if there's anything there. And then the other thing is I'd love to know why you've moved from conflict resolution to conflict empathy, which is actually a really lovely, I think it's a really beautiful kind of expression, but I'm just interested in why that sort of label has changed.
I'll do the label bit, and I'll give the belonging one to Adrian. I'll land that one on him. It's the easier one. It's really the words that fit within it. So what we're looking for is evidence of how you present yourself when you are going through some sort of a dispute. And when I looked at the words that made it up, it was around the sentiment of being ethical. It was around being just. It was around using wisdom. The notions were around selflessness, and resolution didn't quite fit that, but it did seem to me that would take a lot of empathy, and actually, and one the other aspect is that we want our leaders to be able to demonstrate all of those particular traits, right? Do you know what I mean? Moving forward, so I found the reframing of that was much more appreciative than conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take the hospital pass, shall I? Okay, brilliant. I'll move my way to the hospital pass via your heartening and disheartening bit first, just to gear me up to that last bit. And I think I agree with you. It is heartening and disheartening. But when you're sitting in your roles and you're being asked to deliver change, and of course it'd be different because we run this in organizations and we run it in multiple sectors and there's always nuances. But when something's homogenous like that, it means you don't have to do a full segmentation on the change, because a lot of the stuff that we do obviously follows this when we're working with clients, because we've got hundreds of people trained in our methodology. It can be coaching, group coaching, OD shifts, to workshopping around growth mindset and things like that. So that kind of homogenous aspect to it can be helpful when it comes to resolution. And the bit about belonging, I'm going to avoid because there's two questions here, and we know we're close on time. But I actually think that belonging question, if we had more time, is an open question to us all, right? Because that's half the point with us. When we're doing our stuff in organizations, sometimes we're very careful to go from quant right into remedial action. And sometimes you run quant and then you'll run some qual to find out what sits underneath that. Classic example is sometimes when we see psychological safety and it's really, really low, I could pile in there and give reason to that. But sometimes when we do qual and teams, we find out that the leader is running quite a tyrannical team and doesn't allow people to speak up. So it's not like there's psychological safety in there. They are stopped from that. And these are the nuances that we need to understand before we jump in. But I think you've got two questions there, Richard.
I have indeed. This is why he gives you the difficult questions. Good answer. Thanks, Adrian. Jane and then Fiona. Jane, thanks a lot. Thanks, Julia.
Great, thank you very much. Generally, I work for a food manufacturing business, and we've done quite a lot of work on global engagement. And one of the questions that we get is this causal link between performance and engagement, and which, is it chicken and egg? So I'm just sort of throwing it into the discussion, I suppose. What we hear is when we look at a site that's performed very well, then we look at all the engagement survey indicators, and guess what? They're all much more positive than other sites. So we can draw a conclusion that there we go. Look, if you work on engagement, the performance will go up. But the opposite is also true. A better performing site will oftentimes have higher scores in the engagement survey just by virtue of the fact that people are feeling good, that the site is performing well. And sometimes it's difficult to get the narrative right to show that the direction between those two things. So just that was the first thought that I had from what you were saying. And then I just wanted to talk, or I suppose again make an observation about that gap between the non-executive view and the executive view. And actually I'm not surprised there's a gap, because non-execs typically, there is a time lag just because they're only meeting 4 times a year, say they're only touching with a very limited surface level view of the business. So it's maybe not that big a surprise that they have a more negative view of the extent of creativity and innovation than the executive team do. So I don't know if it's an observation of a challenge or a question or interest, a level of interest, I suppose. So that was all I want to say, Richard. Thank you.
It's Jane, appreciate it. Martin, did you want to come on and leave that the second point? Because I know you were making the point about the LEDs.
Yeah, well, actually, I want to talk about the first point because I think it's very interesting, and it kind of goes back to, you're all familiar with performance, but it's also about how you get there, right? And that's kind of what's really, really important. So, and that's where the values are very, very interesting. So you can have a high performing organization, but if we saw within the data that there was a department performing really, really well, but community was really, really low compared to other aspects, then we can predict that that's a bit of a problem for the longevity and the sustainability of the organization. So I think, even with the engagement reports, what you're looking for is performance, but how they've actually got there.
Yeah. Just to add one sentence to that, engagement surveys are sometimes, when you're looking at that data, you're already too late, because the engagement stuff is measuring outputs. You've got to understand what sits underneath engagement. So what's the team dynamics, leadership behavior that's driving the engagement? And that's linked to the culture, which is where we live. So when we understand that, we can see a link between culture and engagement and performance. But we can equally see where you're at risk. So you might be performing well, but we can see psychological safety falling, cultural health changing. So we know that there's an iceberg somewhere, and it might manifest in the press, but we will see it because we're looking underneath engagement.
Okay. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Martin. And thanks, Jane. Fiona, hello.
Hi, thank you. I'm really interested in that gap at that senior to junior level around the kind of innovation, creativity, change, and kind of how that might be playing out in the workplace, and kind of any insight on how you're seeing that play out and any interventions that you're seeing people take to respond to that. Because I think certainly that's something I see where I'm working. So just, yeah, looking for any insight.
So obviously we're doing a huge merger now of I think about 12,000 people, and they've just bought a business of a couple of thousand people, and they can see that that innovation piece is really low, but they understand they need it to deliver on the strategy. And to be honest with these guys, it's a whole root and branch thing where we're looking at stuff that's going to set up the culture. So there's attitudinal stuff that they're obviously using our data to see the delta, but there's also stuff in design, and there's stuff around experimentation. So there's a whole piece around sort of org design that we're doing, and there's stuff about getting people to experiment so that you can create safe spaces so people can start to lean into it. That's how we've done it at that end. At the other end, we've just run workshops. We've seen it in law firms where senior leaders see more innovation than the people they work with. And what we've done is we've just run loads of sessions with different teams on growth mindset. So we've operated at away day right the way to consultant change transformation in that area. So it's always an interesting one. I was just gonna say there was the love when we were talking about engagement. She raised the point around non-exec and innovation, didn't she?
Yep.
Between the two. And I think there is a lag, but what I find interesting, so we end up getting a lot of work through the non-exec direct community, and the reason is because sometimes they feel they're just at the behest of what the excos share. So sometimes Excos feel comfortable that actually, when it comes to the financial data, our risk is mitigated because we've got the Big Four looking at the data. When it comes to products and services, IP is protected through the law firms. When it comes to people and attitude, they've got an engagement survey or what Exco tell them. And actually, having something that drills down means that they can have a deeper, um, um, shall we say, relationship with what's going on. And I think sometimes that's why the gap is, because they're just working with what they are on the receiving end of, and they don't have the data to tell them exactly what's going on. I think that could be some of the empathy gap.
That Jane was referring to earlier. Yeah, okie doke. Fiona, thank you. I think last question, just go to Catherine if I may.
Hi there. Good to be with you again. Same topic as Fiona, actually, around innovation and an observation. I think innovation is quite difficult, isn't it? Because it's a bit like when you ask someone what strategy, you get a range of response. Same with innovation. Are you innovating in a process, or are you innovating at the corporate level? So I think there's probably lots of different perspectives that come through in that innovation rating. But I think as well, and it would be interesting, I don't know, Adrian, if or Martin, whether you do a correlation between that innovation score and hierarchy, because certainly much of what we've been talking about is impediments to innovation. So what's blocking innovation? And a lot of it's bureaucracy or structure or processes. Getting too internally focused, not externally focused. So I'm just wondering if you've seen any further correlation on that kind of innovation scale.
Oh, good question. What do you think?
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
jump
So,
in. Martin, go on, Martin.
yeah, I was just going to say, so you've described the wheel almost perfectly. So if we just go back to visualizing that, because the correlation is because we are the UK so tradition focused, which is great, right? We're very respectful, very polite, and there's lots of activity going on here. And then directly opposite is this innovation space. So all of our activity and this politeness and all of this, not necessarily being able to speak up, challenge and disrupt, that crowds out sentiments and concepts and ideas to do with innovation and creativity. And innovation, of course, is just about the new, but creativity is about actually birthing something new, right? So that's a sort of a technical expertise. So it seems that whilst we have whilst we are able to create the internet and do lots of fantastic things, they seem to be outliers compared to the population as a whole, if that makes sense. Right, I'm sure that's a rambling answer, but hopefully there's something in there.
No, it wasn't rambling, but there's also a point that Catherine was making about hierarchy specifically. That was a cultural answer, it wasn't rambling at all, but it's and highly relevant. But
Yes, the hierarchy sits in the
yeah.
tradition space.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean. Sorry.
Yeah.
And that's
Sorry.
where we sometimes see it in the cultural health. That's why sometimes the one thing about everyone can talk about the culture they want, and everyone can go to conferences and they talk about servant leadership and we need this and kindness and all. But if you don't know your culture today, how can you chart your journey? And half the bit around innovation is people not knowing their starting point. And sometimes their starting point is what you're describing. It's hierarchical, can be bureaucratic, all these impediments. And sometimes our job is just to fix the impediments, to give space to breathe, to then be able to lead into innovation. So it is completely out of odds, that hierarchy in innovation, and sometimes you need to start there. I was just going to say, because I know we're on time, but obviously we've only showed you a sliver, I mean, less than a sliver of the amount of content we've got. So I was just going to say, you'll probably be sending stuff around, but if anyone wants to grow at brandswithvalues.com, I say grow at brandswithvalues.com. We've got huge amounts of stuff that we can share across multiple industries.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate it. And thanks, Martin. Thanks both. Always good working with you. Thanks ever so much for taking us through that. There's a lot of nuance there and details and some quite startling figures there, which makes you think. So, network members, lovely to see you. We'll see you at the next one. And we'll send the slides around shortly. Thanks, chaps. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.